This is Gagan Girotra, IIT Roorkee class of 2000, and I am Calcutta class of 2005. Welcome to the People Plus video on critical reasoning. In this video, we are going to cover the basics of critical reasoning. Alright, so while we begin with our discussion on critical reasoning, it is important to understand the difference between critical reasoning and deductive logic, okay, or logical reasoning, as some of you may have recalled. So let's look at this statement, this set of statements. It says most actors are celebrities. Amir is an actor, therefore Amir is a celebrity. Okay. Now, while you would recall that such statements are very common when we talk about syllogisms, and syllogisms we can typically solve using Venn diagrams. So let's say if I were to solve this problem from the deductive logic point of view, what we're going to get is most actors are celebrities, right? So if this circle is actors, right, then most actors are celebrities, right? So these are actors and these are celebrities. So most of the actors, you would notice this smaller circle, most of this circle lies in the celebrity circle, right? So if most actors are celebrities, I can represent this when it comes to logical reasoning or deductive logic as this diagram. Yeah. Then the next statement talks about a specific case. Amir is an actor, right? So Amir is an actor. That means Amir could lie anywhere in this circle, right? So this conclusion says, therefore Amir is a celebrity. When we approach this problem from logical reasoning or deductive logic point of view, this statement may or may not be true, right? So when we are doing the logical reasoning problems, this statement we will have to mark as false. Why? Because this statement may be true, this statement may not be true. However, when we talk about critical reasoning, in critical reasoning we are dealing with shades of gray. Okay, so while this statement may be completely false, this statement may be completely true, right? We are dealing, the critical reasoning part deals with whatever lies in between, right? So there may be some statements which are most likely false, there are some statements which are most likely true, and there are some statements which may be false, may be true with equal probability, right? So this statement, Amir is a celebrity, is most likely true. It's not exactly true, right? So it probably falls somewhere here when we talk about critical reasoning, right? So you realize the difference now. In deductive logic or logical reasoning, this statement will be false, but in critical reasoning, we will accept this statement for a discussion because this statement is most likely true. All right, so like I said, this statement is deductively invalid, while this statement is fairly good for critical reasoning, right? Because this is most likely to occur, and we can have in a critical reasoning discussion, we can have additional statements which may or may not strengthen whatever we are trying to say, right? So there's a more detailed discussion that follows. So what it says is, for logicians, the term valid is applicable only for deductive arguments. It is not valid for critical reasoning arguments. All right. Now, after this comparison between deductive and critical reasoning, let's look at some of the basic components of critical reasoning. All right. So the first component that we are going to talk about when it comes to critical reasoning is a premise. Now, premise is basically that statement on which the rest of the argument is based. Okay. Now, a conclusion, very briefly, a conclusion is a statement which I am deriving from the premise. Okay, so if I were to take an example, I like cookies. Yeah, I am going to eat a cookie, right? So if in this case, I am my premise is I like cookies, right? And the conclusion is I'm going to eat this cookie. Yeah, so this is how an argument typically gets structured. In conclusions, sometimes there may be certain intermediate conclusions and certain main conclusions. We're going to talk about these in greater detail when we talk about the example. All right. Then the third thing we are talking about, the third component of critical reasoning, is assumption, and the assumption is typically unstated. the assumption is the bridge that actually links the premise and the conclusion. Okay, we're going to look at this in greater detail. All right, sometimes there may be background information. Okay, sometimes some critical reasoning arguments may or may not have background information. Some critical reasoning arguments, while they may have a main conclusion, they may also talk about countering that conclusion, right? And that is a counter conclusion. All of these components together form the argument of a critical reasoning. Okay, now with these basic definitions in mind, I'm going to take you to an example, and we'll break that example up one piece at a time and see how each of these components fit in there. All right, so let's look at this argument, this sample argument. Yesterday, Jenny and I went to watch a movie. There we saw a boy and a girl watching the movie together. Jenny said they could be friends, but I was sure that they were lovers who would get married soon. Okay, so this is, this is a speaker telling us what happened yesterday. So what happened was he and Jenny, they went to watch a movie. They saw a couple there. They saw a boy and a girl. Jenny and the speaker, they were differing in opinions. Jenny said they could be friends, but the speaker believed that they were lovers who were going to get married. All right, so let's start with identifying the conclusion. While in the general scheme of things, conclusions, they typically come at the end of whatever you're saying, right? So for example, a movie's conclusion, it comes at the end of the movie. Here what we are going to do is, for the purpose of critical reasoning, the first thing we are going to do is identify a conclusion, and you'll see the logic. You'll understand why identifying the conclusion first makes a lot of sense. So if you notice here, there are two conclusions, two different people who are drawing two different conclusions. The first conclusion is drawn by Jenny, right? Jenny says they could be friends, right? They means the boy and the girl who are watching movie, yeah? And the speaker, so this is the first conclusion. The second conclusion, speaker concludes that they were lovers, or they are lovers who would get married soon, right? So is it clear that these two people have derived two different conclusions? All right. Now, while these two conclusions are derived from the same information, right? So Jenny and the speaker, both of them, they saw the same boy and girl. They saw them watching the movie together, but they have derived two completely different conclusions from what they've seen, right? So Jenny's conclusion is they could be friends, and the speaker's conclusion is they could be lovers. Now in this case, because these conclusions are not consistent, right? Because they are not consistent, we are going to say that one of them is counter conclusion and the other is main conclusion of the argument. Okay, now how do you identify a counter conclusion from a main conclusion? See, what is happening in this sentence is that the speaker has mentioned Jenny's conclusion first, right? And then he says, but I was sure, right? So it's basically the speaker's conclusion that now becomes, that takes the mantle of the main conclusion. All right, so we take speaker's conclusion as the main conclusion, and because Jenny's conclusion is not consistent with speaker's conclusion, Jenny's conclusion becomes counter conclusion, right? Is it clear? Okay, let's move on. So Jenny's conclusion, they could be friends, and the speaker's conclusion, they could be they were most likely lovers who were going to get married. Now let's break up the main conclusion. Okay, so this is the main conclusion that we've decided that this is the main conclusion of the argument. Now you notice that this main conclusion is also actually two parts. The main conclusion says they are lovers who would get married soon, right? So they are lovers, they are going to get married soon. So these are the two sub conclusions that form the real main conclusion, right? Now between these two sub conclusions, how do you identify which one comes first, which one is the intermediate conclusion, and which one is the real main conclusion? It's very straightforward. If one conclusion leads to the other, right, then the first conclusion is the intermediate conclusion. Now look at this. So the first conclusion says they are lovers, right? Second conclusion is they will be married soon. Yeah. So if they are lovers, they will get married, or if they are married, they will become lovers. Clearly, if they are lovers, they will get married, right? So therefore, this becomes the intermediate conclusion, right? And this becomes the main conclusion, right? I hope this part's clear, that even the speaker's conclusion can be further subdivided, right? Subdivision based on whether an intermediate conclusion leads to another conclusion. So we can, split that up, and there you have it. We have our counter conclusion, we have our intermediate conclusion, and we have our main conclusion. All right, so in on this sheet, you can notice that there are some words, yeah, that will help you identify whether a sentence is a conclusion or not, right? So these words are typically uh, the words that denote the result of something, the outcome of something, right? So you notice, thus, it shows that, as a result, XYZ happened, therefore, accordingly, and so on, right? So you can take a note of these words. These words may or may not be there. For example, they're not really here, yeah, but typically if these words are present, they would help you identify a conclusion sentence within the argument. Okay, now that we've identified our conclusions, let's look at identifying the premise. Let's identify the premise. Now, premise, as we've discussed previously, is the basic information on which conclusion is drawn, right? So in this case, the conclusion that Jenny draws is they could be friends. The speaker draws the conclusion that they could be lovers who would get married soon. Why have they, on what information or on what view have they formed this conclusion? Have they drawn this conclusion? Clearly, it is this sentence: we saw a boy and a girl watching a movie together, right? So whatever information forms the basis of conclusion, okay, is called the premise. So premise is really like the foundation on which the conclusion, the building, is built, okay, right? So this is the premise: boy and a girl watching movie together. All right, so some of these words which may indicate a premise: because, right? So because highlights the reason for something. Since, right? For example, right? All of these words, they are indicating, they are indicative of the information on which a conclusion can be based. Okay, so you may take a note of these words. Moving on. All right, so let's look at a possible sentence, which a possible background information sentence. Now, this background information may or may not always be there. Now, notice that yesterday Jenny and I went to watch a movie. This sentence presents the background of everything, of what the premise is and what the conclusion drawn was, right? So this really, if you notice that, I can do away with this information without having much impact on the conclusion or the premise, right? Yesterday Jenny and I went to watch a movie, right? Or for all I care, I could have said yesterday Jenny and I were sitting at home watching a movie, right? So it doesn't really matter to the premise and the conclusion. It's just setting up, it is just giving us some information as to, the situation where whatever was said was said. Okay, so this sentence, the first sentence, yesterday Jenny and I went to watch a movie, is the background sentence. This is typically not very important. You can just keep it aside while discussing the core of the issue. Okay, so core of the issue is what is inside these brackets. The rest is background here. All right, now comes the most important part, and that is identifying the assumption. Now, you would recall that when I defined assumption, I mentioned that the assumption really is what links the premise to the conclusion, right? So the premise in this case, you would notice that there were two situations here. So to start with, the premise was a boy and girl watching a movie together, right? This premise was common for both Jenny and the speaker. From here, Jenny, right? Jenny concluded they are friends, right? This is Jenny's conclusion. And from the same information, same premise, the speaker concluded that they were lovers who were going to get married, right? Now, same premise leading to the first conclusion, same premise leading to the second conclusion. What exactly is the difference between what Jenny is thinking or what Jenny has in mind and what speaker has in mind? Let's see what Jenny has in mind. So what happens is that whenever Jenny sees a boy and a girl watching a movie together, she straight away assumes that they have to be friends, right? So if you notice, the structure of an assumption, of Jenny's assumption here, is that if the premise is true, if premise true, then conclusion must be true, right? So really speaking, all I'm trying to say here is that any assumption, right, is it takes the shape if premise in general is true, right? If any boy and girl, so this is Jenny's assumption I'm talking about. If so, Jenny's assumption here is if any boy and a girl is watching a movie together, they must be friends, right? So that's why when Jenny sees this specific boy and girl, she concludes that they are friends. Okay. Now, based on this same principle, right, if premise is true, then conclusion must be true. Let's figure out the speaker's assumption. So speaker's assumption here becomes very clearly, if any boy and girl have come to watch a movie together, they have to be lovers who are going to get married soon. So you notice that the assumption is very simply, if premise in general is true, then the conclusion in general must be true. Okay, so I've written the speaker's assumption here. The speaker's assumption is if a boy and girl are watching a movie together, they must be lovers who would get married soon, right? So this forms the assumption of the of our argument. All right, quick summary. So any critical reasoning argument it absolutely must have a conclusion. Okay, without a conclusion there is no critical reasoning argument, right? That conclusion has to be based on a certain premise. Okay, so these two components of a critical reasoning argument are a must. The others you may or may not have in the argument. Okay, so a premise and a conclusion, they have to be stated in an argument, and these are the key the key components that you must identify. Then assumption. Assumption is typically the unstated. It is the unstated bridge that links premise and the conclusion. You would recall that if the premise in general is true, then the conclusion in general must be true. Okay, so that's assumption. It is typically unstated. Again, it forms the pillar of a critical reasoning argument. It forms the link between the premise and the conclusion. Okay, and the optional portions of an argument which may or may not be present is the background, right? So this just gives you the situation in which the whole situation is based, and the counter conclusion. This may or may not be present. This sometimes it typically serves to confuse the main conclusion. So this, again, like background, this may or may not be present, but these two will be present, and this will typically be unstated. Now let's discuss question types that you can see while attempting questions on critical reasoning. Now the first question type you would find is that you would be required to identify the assumption. I mentioned previously that assumptions are typically not stated. Yeah, so a question could very well ask you, They could give you a premise and a conclusion along with all the other stuff, background, etc. And then they could ask you to identify the key assumption, right? So that's the first question type you could see. The second question type you could find in a critical reasoning argument is to identify a conclusion. Now, I have mentioned previously in this video that conclusions are an absolute must for an argument, right? So while that is true, sometimes the conclusion itself may not be given, right? So which means that you would be given a premise, you would be given something akin to an assumption or an assumption, and you would be required to figure out what the conclusion of the argument is, okay? Because obviously without a conclusion, the argument is not complete. The third kind of question you can find in critical reasoning is that you would be required to identify the role of a sentence in the argument, right? So the argument would have sentences related to background, sentences which are giving you a premise, sentences which are sometimes even giving you an assumption or a conclusion. You would be required to identify the role of that sentence in the argument, right? So that's the third kind of questions you can see in critical reasoning. Now, once you've you've done your um, the breakup of all of these sentences, you've identified each and every sentence's role. You may be asked to strengthen or weaken the argument, right? So you may be asked to identify out of the given set of statements which statement strengthens the argument and which statement weakens the argument. Now, strengthening and weakening, right? Typically, the best way of strengthening or weakening an argument is to attack or to support the assumption. These are typically strengthening or weakening the assumption of the argument. Because let's say, I mean, in the given question, in the example that we've been talking about, if you were to attack the premise, it's rather flimsy. For example, the example argument that we've been discussing, look at that boy and girl, right? Now, what if I attack the premise itself and say, oh no, they're not a boy and a girl, they're both girls or they're both boys, right? So what I've done is I've attacked the premise, but that's a very frivolous way of attacking an argument. Typically, a classy way of attacking the argument is to attack the assumption. Okay, so that's what these questions relate to. Now, based on whatever we've discussed, we have learned how to identify the assumption, right? Because you would recall the assumption is typically if the premise in general is true, then the conclusion in general must be true. We have also learned to identify the role of a sentence in the argument, right? That's these two things we've already done. Now let's look at some of the other question types. I think that there's one more question type that I can add to here, and that is finding the flaw in the argument. Yeah, so finding the flaw again is finding inconsistencies in the assumption itself. Okay, so let me call it the sixth one. So these three are what we will discuss in a little bit of detail, because we have learned how to identify the assumption. We have learned to identify or derive a conclusion also in our previous discussion. In the discussion so far, we have identified the role of each sentence in the argument. We've done this also. Now we'll talk about these three types: strengthening, weakening, and finding the flaw in the argument, right? So let's just recall our argument again. The argument was, we went to watch a movie, we saw a boy and a girl. Jenny said they were friends, and I thought they were lovers and would get married soon. We had identified the role of each and every sentence in this argument. Yeah, I'll just quickly move on. Let's talk about weakening the speaker's argument. Now, if we are required to weaken the speaker's argument, right? What if I said this? In this part of the country, lovers typically do not go out on a movie date, right? So you remember the speaker's argument. The speaker's assumption was any boy and girl, they are lovers and they'll probably get married soon, right? But if I say that in this part of the country where we've gone to watch this movie, lovers typically do not go on a movie date. So how could they be lovers? The couple that we see, they could not be lovers, sir. So what I've done is, by stating this, I have weakened the speaker's assumption and hence the speaker's argument, right? So this is how we weaken the speaker's argument. All right, let's move on. Uh, while we are weakening an argument, right? So some basic theory around it. We just have to undermine the conclusion. Okay, so I mean, I could well have said in this part of the country that lovers generally do not go out on a movie date, right? So this is good enough to undermine the conclusion. If I had said in this part of the country lovers never go on a movie date, then I have destroyed the argument. Okay, but what we are looking for is, we are looking for statements that weaken the speaker's argument, not necessarily destroy it. So even in this part of the country, lovers generally do not go out on a movie date is a good enough statement to weaken the argument. Okay. All right, and these are some of the pointers, some of the words that you'll find in the questions, which will tell you that you're required to weaken the argument, right? So you'll see words like which of the following statements attacks the speaker's argument, or undermines the speaker's arguments, or argues against the speaker, and so on and so forth, right? So you can take note of these words. All right, moving on. Let's talk about strengthening the speaker's argument, right? So like I said previously, strengthening the argument, we will typically try to consolidate the speaker's assumption. Okay, so let's say if I were to say, in this part of the country, a boy asks a girl out for a movie only if he's in love with her and wants to propose to her, right? So if that is the case, and you know, and that's what typically happens, then yes, then whatever speaker says makes a lot of sense, right? The speaker's argument is strengthened. Why? Because this is what typically happens, right? So this statement has strengthened the speaker's argument, right? Right. So while we are strengthening, right, we must only consolidate on what the speaker has assumed. Okay, it need not be that I mean, a statement like, in this part of the country, only lovers who are engaged to get married, right, they go out on a movie date. Then yes, then what I've said is, I've completely made the assumption 100% certainty, right? But that need not be so. You may not be required to make it 100% certain. You are just required to consolidate, right? So maybe increase the percentage. If let's say what the speaker said was maybe 50% true, the statement adds up another 20% to it. Yeah. So that's how you strengthen the speaker's argument. Again, you strengthen the speaker's argument by strengthening the assumption that the speaker has made, right? So this is again some of the words that will help you identify the question which is asking you to strengthen the argument. Which of the following most justifies what the speaker is saying, or supports what the speaker is saying, or strengthens what the speaker is saying. Okay. All right. Now the third kind of questions that you know that are relevant to the assumption, right, is finding the flaw in speaker's argument, right? So finding the flaw is basically, again, you're attacking the assumption and you're finding if there's any logical holes in what has been assumed, right? So clearly one of the logical holes has already been pointed out by the counter conclusion, right? So what Jenny had said, she had said they could be friends, but no, I said no, I am quite sure that they are lovers, they're not just friends, right? So if we were to list out all the things that could go wrong in what the speaker has assumed, it is what Jenny says, this boy and girl could be friends, or they could be related, right? They could be boy and a girl, you don't know them, right? So they could be the boy and girl could be brother sister, they could be cousins, right? Or they could be classmates, for all you care, right? The third possible flaw is that they could already be married, right? You don't know that. You don't know whether they are married or not. You just assume that they are lovers who will get married, right? So if they're already married, then obviously that's a flaw in what the speaker has assumed. Another way of finding the flaw, another flaw in the speaker's argument here, is that they may not be alone at all, right? So they're probably a part of a bigger group, and the group has got their seating somewhere else, and they had just these two seats in another corner, and both of them are sitting there. So there's no question that they are alone and they're lovers and they would get married soon. So all of these are possible flaws in the speaker's argument, right? So I'll just very quickly summarize what we've discussed. We've discussed what an argument looks like, what is the structure of an argument, right? And then we went on to identify each and every part of the argument, right? So each and every sentence is contributing, or every part of the sentence is contributing in certain way to the argument, right? So we have helped identify that. And then we have gone on to discuss the question types, right? Which range from identifying what the argument is, identifying what kind of what sentences, what the role of each sentence is in the argument, or for that matter, finding the flaws in the argument, or strengthening, weakening the argument. Thanks for watching the video. You can give your feedback in the comments section below. Please click the like button if you thought the video was helpful. For lesson updates, you may subscribe to my YouTube channel People Plus, or you may read my blogs at peopleprep.com, or you can directly connect to us through our Facebook page @PeoplePlus, or you can email to me at gagan@peopleplus.com. Thank you.